change of your name, the change of your clothes, those kind of things are not neutral. And they could potentially lead you down a journey of permanent change. So, for example, a girl who starts injecting testosterone because she's read about it online and someone's told her how to do it. If you inject testosterone for long enough, you can become infertile. You can lose all potential sexual function. You can have a deep voice and stubble for life. Those are not irreversible changes by any means. And so if we ban, or at least if there's a chilling effect on people kind of counseling young people wisely, talking about their feelings, helping them to understand them, helping them to understand long-term impacts, if we ban that kind of wise counsel, then we are putting children in serious danger of making permanent changes, permanent harms to their bodies.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK. I'm Darren Grimes, and I'd absolutely love it if you could support the channel by hitting the subscribe button and that little notification bell after enjoying today's content, which I'm absolutely certain that you will. You can also help keep our independent voices here at Reasoned online by clicking the donate link in the description. Now, as viewers will likely already be aware, Nicola Sturgeon's government's Gender Recognition Bill has caused a constitutional showdown with the Westminster government. So why is that? The bill, which was passed in Parliament last month, will be blocked from receiving Royal Assent. It's constitutionally important because it's the first time that Westminster has used this mechanism since the devolved settlement was introduced almost 25 years ago. Now, the bill would mean someone aged 16 can change their gender without a medical diagnosis of a gender dysphoria, and mean that you only have to live in your favoured gender for 3 months, taking it down from the current 2 years with medical checks and balances. Now, Westminster say that, well, hang on a minute, mate, essentially, that this would actually interfere with equalities matters in the rest of the UK. Now, critics, such as today's guest, have raised concerns that sexual predators could actually obtain one of these easy-to-access self-ID certificates and access single-sex spaces and potentially place at risk vulnerable women in toilets, in changing rooms, in refuges, prisons, you name it, and potentially place women in harm's way. Now, for making this point, for making this argument, my guest has received, I think it's safe to say, a fair amount of venom and vitriol from the swivel-eyed, flag-waving so-called progressives that seek to ride roughshod, in my view, over sex-based rights, hard thought for that they were. Now, let's see what she's got to say about it, though. So joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is Miriam Cates MP, Conservative MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge. Miriam, thank you very much for your time.
Lovely to be here.
Now, Miriam, could you just set out why you're in agreement with others, such as Labour's Rosie Duffield MP, a bit of a lonely voice on the Labour benches, in actually standing against Nicola Sturgeon's proposed bill?
Yes, well, I think there are all kinds of complex issues that the bill throws up. I mean, obviously, there are the kind of technical arguments about whether this impacts on UK-wide law, and therefore the Scottish Parliament isn't allowed to affect UK-wide law, in this case, the Equalities Act. So that's the kind of political and technical argument for the government blocking the bill. But of course, the real issues that will matter to most people are the impacts on women's and children's safety and the potential safeguarding risks that the bill throws up. Because, of course, if it's incredibly easy to change your legal gender, to change your birth certificate with no checks and balances, to be able to do it very quickly, then it opens up a kind of loophole for potential predators who want to gain access to women and children. Now, critics of this position are kind of accusing me and others of saying that everybody who wants to change their gender is a potential predator. That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is that experience and history and fact teaches us that people who are sexual predators, people who do want to abuse children, will use any loophole available to them to gain access to vulnerable children. And that is the issue here. And we've seen recently a report by Professor Alexis Jay into institutional child sexual abuse across the last decades in our institutions. And the common theme is that predators will do anything they can to get access to children. And the problem is that if anyone can change their gender, anyone can change their birth certificate, private, with no checks and balances. You can then evade certain criminal records checks. You can exploit loopholes in the DBS system in order to gain access to women and children. And that is the key safeguarding issue here, and why so many people are concerned. And there are other issues around single-sex spaces, which I can, go into if you want me to. But really, we are very concerned about the safeguarding risks involved in opening up this ability to change your legal gender very, very easily.
Yeah, so do you take umbrage with those then that say, well, hang on a minute, Miriam, there are still safeguards because you've got to live in your new gender for 3 months? They're saying that actually this just reduces the regulatory burden, and that actually it's an anti-trans argument to suggest that it could be abused.
Well, I think it's very naive to think that it won't be abused. Unfortunately, the papers are full week by week of cases where people have abused all sorts of processes in law in order to commit crime. And it's a sad fact, but it's a true fact. And so any law like this must take into account how could people abuse it if they potentially did want to gain access to vulnerable people. And 3 months is not very long. And what does it even mean to live in your preferred gender? I mean, are we talking about wearing different clothes? Are we talking about using different facilities? What does that even mean? It's so loose. It's not based on a kind of, legal fact. It's not based on anything objective. It's far too easy to be abused. And I think also lowering the legal age limit at the moment across the UK, you can obtain a gender recognition certificate from the age of 18, but following some quite significant safeguards to that process. But if you reduce that to 16 and make it really easy, you can kind of see the potential safeguarding risk for young people. How do you know at 16 if you think you want to be a different gender for the rest of your life? How do you know the implications of that? There's lots of reasons why you can't make big permanent decisions about your life at 16 because our brains just aren't developed enough to kind of foresee the consequences. And so again, reducing the age limit also, I think, is a safeguarding risk for children.
Miriam, I just want to play this clip to show my viewers the kind of response, because I imagine many of them will be saying, right, I agree with this. I agree with what Miriam's just set out, very reasonable and sensible stuff. But actually, I just want to show the response in Parliament that you had just the other day for advancing such arguments.
Goodness me, that speech was probably one of the worst transphobic dog whistle speeches that I've heard in an awful long time. The idea of linking trans people with predators, frankly, is disgusting, and you should be ashamed.
No, calm down. Yes.
No.
Lord Russell-Moyle.
Way to you, or anyone else, to the honourable member, Now, on the substance of this, ignoring that horrible speech that we have just heard,
Order, Peter Bottomley.
Did the chair hear anything transphobic in the previous speech?
Now, Miriam, I could go on, but in essence, I actually think the chair should have said, hang on a minute, you can't speak to somebody like that. I thought it was an absolutely outrageous thing to say, and actually calling you transphobic in and of itself should have been unparliamentary. But you see in that clip, Miriam, I think my viewers can see that you actually rise, you try and speak and intervene. What would you have actually said to him if you were given the opportunity, him being Labour's Lloyd Russell-Moyle, of course?
Well, I was intending to tell him that he was incorrect, that my speech was not at all transphobic, and that I was raising legitimate safeguarding concerns that many women and children feel across the country, and to make the point that this is exactly the reason why people don't raise those safeguarding concerns, because they are labelled and silenced. And I think, to be fair to Madam Deputy Speaker, I doubt she could hear my speech, because throughout the time I was speaking, the SNP and Labour was shouting over me throughout the whole speech. Now, you can't hear that particularly well when you listen to the playback, because the microphones in Parliament are very clever and they just pick up, the person who is on their feet generally. But that's why I was speaking quite loudly in some parts of my speech, because I was being shouted over. And there was one point when I think I said that it's a fact that men are significantly stronger than women, and that's why we need single-sex spaces in intimate areas. And a Labour frontbencher shouted, "No, that's not true," or something like that. So that's why I then said, No, it's a fact. So I think it's hard watching back the clip. You don't see the full context of what's going on. But I do feel for the Deputy Speaker, because I doubt she heard my speech. And so she probably didn't feel able to make a judgment.
Now, Lloyd Russell-Moyle of the Socialist Republic of Brighton, he's actually said, Miriam, that he had failed to control his passion in an emotional debate and insisted that actually he stands by the words that he said. It's a bit of a, forgive my French, but it's a bit of a half-arsed apology, Miriam. Do you accept it?
Well, I think a bit of emotion in Parliament in any debate is inevitable, and passions run high. We all understand that, but actually, and I personally have had an enormous amount of support from my own colleagues and from the public. So I'm not seeking some kind of apology for the sake of it, but I do think there's a wider question here, which is, how are women supposed to speak up about their legitimate concerns about their own safety when they are then silenced by angry men? Let's be honest. And if we needed greater proof of women's need for protection from biological men than his speech, then I don't think we're going to find it. So, it was quite illustrative of the kind of reaction that many women face. And, there's a free speech issue about that, but there's also a big safeguarding issue about that, because one of the many reasons that people don't raise safeguarding concerns in, say, for example, suspected child sexual abuse, like we saw in Rotherham, is because they worry that they're going to be labelled as bigots or whatever it is. And so if even in Parliament a woman cannot speak about her own experience of as I said, of feeling frightened once in a toilets in a restaurant because a man walked in, if when a woman even in Parliament shares that experience, she is shouted down, then my concern is that has a chilling effect on women across the country who need to be able to speak out, and not just women, men as well. There are plenty of men who want to speak out on this issue but are worried about the reaction. And unfortunately, Parliament should be setting an example of how we listen to people's concerns about safeguarding, and that was a really, really bad example to set.
Absolutely. It seems that you can be called every ism and phobia on the planet in an attempt, frankly, to shut down debate and speech because you feel uncomfortable with the issues being raised, even if the issues being raised are about safeguarding and protecting sex-based rights. I mean, how the hell has the left managed to get itself into this mess?
Yes, I mean, if that's progress, it doesn't look particularly attractive, does it? And I think, I do feel sorry for my colleagues in the Labour Party, and Rosie Duffield, who you mentioned earlier on, is an absolute hero, because I do think they are very ideologically divided on this issue. And as many problems as the Conservative Party might have, this isn't particularly one of them. And I think on our benches, although of course there's nervousness about speaking out about it, I think most people are pretty convinced that biological reality is important, child safeguarding is important. We need to be careful how we navigate these issues, but we do need to stand up for women and children's safety. Whereas I think, in the Labour Party, it's not like that at all. And I know Rosie has faced the most appalling conditions and lack of support. So yes, they do seem to be tying themselves in knots over this. And I don't think they're representing ordinary people.
Now, Miriam, you've mentioned safeguarding issues for children in what you've said earlier. Now, do you worry that your party's ban, speaking on the potential splits within the Conservative Party itself, do you worry that your party's ban on the so-called trans conversion therapy will actually risk precluding medical professionals from actually being able to explore potential other pathways for children who may well be struggling with, whether it be puberty or struggling with their sexuality or a whole host of other things that come to mind, and are quite common, frankly, aren't they, with adolescents in general? And it could even be, Miriam, a priest offering to pray for a child, right, being accused of some form of conversion therapy or being transphobic again, and those watchwords of the moment. Are you worried about the potential unintended consequences of such a wide-ranging ban?
Yes, I am. And I think we need to be very careful as we approach this bill, which the government announced last week. And I think clearly there are some, abhorrent practices that have occurred in the past, possibly are today, that of course should not be allowed. And many would be illegal already under the law. And, we need to be absolutely clear about that. Those kind of things are abhorrent. And that is what this ban is really supposed to catch. But yes, we do need to be very careful about thinking about children who might be struggling with gender, with their biological sex, partly in no doubt because of what they see online and the kind of very rapid change we've seen in understanding of this area over the past 10 years. And I think, whilst people might think dressing as the opposite sex, changing your pronouns sounds quite innocuous, actually the judgment of Dr. Hilary Cass, who's run a review into gender services, is that that's kind of social transitioning. The change of your name, the change of your clothes, those kind of things are not neutral, and they could potentially lead you down a journey of permanent change. So for example, a girl who starts injecting testosterone because she's read about it online and someone's told her how to do it. If you inject testosterone for long enough, you can become infertile. You can lose all potential sexual function. You can have a deep voice and stubble for life. Those are not irreversible changes by any means. And so if we ban, or at least if there's a chilling effect on people kind of counselling young people wisely, talking about their feelings, helping them to understand them, helping them to understand long-term impacts, if we ban that kind of wise counsel, then we are putting children in serious danger of making permanent changes, permanent harms to their bodies.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of children, then staying on that particular topic in general, because I think there are real concerns where children are concerned. I mean, you and I, before this recording started, have been having a laugh and carry on about TikTok, Miriam, but it's a real source of, in my view, actually exposing children to the idea that actually the solution to all of their problems in life is through actually gender identity, right? And if only they could bind their breasts and be placed on potentially irreversible hormone treatments and all the rest of it, their lives would be immeasurably better. And I think it's selling children a really dangerous false promise. But on that particular point, one charity that's got itself tied up in this argument is Mermaids. Now, Mermaids is a charity, for viewers that don't know, that's facing its own slew of safeguarding accusations, Miriam, which is currently under investigation by the charity regulator. Now, it's due, actually, despite all of that, Mermaids is due to provide sessions of training for the NHS trust that's taken over the care of trans children from the NHS Tavistock clinic. Now, that particular clinic was found to not be safe. That's not my language, but that's actually the language produced by a report into the clinic itself. Now, this strikes me certainly, but it will strike many viewers as being utterly deranged. Why do you think the NHS has invited Mermaids, of all people, in to take over training for such a really important place of where safeguarding should be sacrosanct?
Well, I'm astounded because, as you said, Mermaids are under investigation, statutory investigation by the Charity Commissioner's Office. And given the safeguarding risks potentially that are going to be found in this investigation, it surprises me that the NHS are willing to engage and use Mermaid services in this period. And of course, the investigation is yet to conclude. We don't know what will be found. But given the potential risks, surely the safest, the most precautionary way of tackling this would be to not use them in the meantime. And certainly the DfE removed Mermaids from their website, from their list of kind of resources that teachers should be used as a precaution. And I'm very surprised that the NHS hasn't done so too. And let's not forget what Mermaids are accused of, their trustees being involved in supporting paedophilia, one of their employees uploading pornography onto Twitter. I mean, there's quite significant issues around child safety here that would lead me certainly to think that they're not suitable at the moment whilst the investigation is ongoing to be working with children. And they're also, they have quite extreme ideology in terms of, they use phrases such as sex assigned at birth, which of course is deeply unscientific. Your sex isn't assigned at birth. It's not chosen at random by a doctor. It's determined at conception, you're male or female. And so, they are very ideological, which makes me worry that the NHS, which should be a medical organisation based on fact, evidence and research, why would they be engaging with such a political organisation like Mermaids?
Yeah, because I heard a Green MSP the other day, a champion of the bill, of Nicola Sturgeon's bill. She was arguing, she was on LBC, and she said that actually, in principle, we should be looking at 8-year-olds, for example, 8-year-olds who was offered by the presenter, LBC's presenter, as a number picked at random, a child's age, and 8 years old, Miriam, and you just sort of think, why can we not, one, strip ideology out of looking after children, out of the area of safeguarding where children are concerned, and also, I'm just not sure what the obsession is with this idea that kids shouldn't just be left alone to be kids. Why do we need to start introducing what I view as themes that ought to only be acceptable for adults, right? Because they're really quite complex matters of who we are, identity and sex and all the rest of it. I don't want sex and gender to be introduced to children of 8 years old, and I'm pretty certain you don't either, Miriam.
No, absolutely. And I think, we need to step back from this and think about, from a wider perspective, what is happening here? Why is this happening to our children? And I think there seems to be almost an agenda of adultification of children, of using children as pawns in a wider adult political agenda. And like you say, these topics about sexuality and gender and identity are all suitable topics for adults to discuss in a democracy, and they're important points of debate that we should be able to speak freely about. But they're not suitable for children, just like all sorts of other ideas are not suitable for children. And you wouldn't teach a 3-year-old about nuclear war, for example, because even though it's an important historical matter that you have to cover at some point, it's not suitable for a 3-year-old. They're not able to process that while still feeling safe. To tell a 3-year-old that they might have been born in the wrong body. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? How does a child even begin to process? And I think what's happened with the internet and with social media and smartphones is that whereas certainly when I was a child, I'm obviously a lot older than you, but, the only influences in a child's life used to be the nuclear family, so parents, the extended family, the community, and school. And so parents had more or less control over the influences and the ideas that their children were listening to. And, your parents knew what books you were reading. Your parents knew what you're watching on TV because there were only 4 channels and it was in the main room of the house. So parents had control over the values and influences that children were accessing. That's gone now. And in the tips of every child's finger is access to any kind of idea, true or false, that exists in the world. And that's why I've been working on the online safety bill this week, which of course is a different matter, but because we have to reverse this. We cannot allow a child of any age to view ideologies that they have no way of assessing as true or false, and to be drawn deliberately by these algorithms into more and more harmful and dangerous ideas and content. And I think, underlying this is an attempt to separate children from their parents. And that is the biggest safeguarding risk of all, because no one is more invested in a child, emotionally, physically, financially than a parent. And they are the ones who should have overall control over the influences on a child's life, particularly when they're very young.
I remember the BBC did, and it's not often, Miriam, that I praise the BBC, but the BBC's Newsnight programme did a deep dive, an expose really into the NHS Tavistock Clinic before all of this came to light, right? Before it was put into special measures and all the rest of it. And I remember listening to some of the whistleblowers that had said, things like, I've had parents come in and say to me, I would prefer a trans outcome over a gay outcome. I've experienced children actually only coming into the clinic maybe once or twice and being placed on these, generally irreversible hormone treatments or things that we just don't know about the consequences of, right? And in things like brain development, that's the question marks that we've got over these matters. And it all stems down to being the TikTok generation, in my view, right? Where young girls, absolutely desperate to feel better about themselves, are being sucked in, as you say, by algorithms and all the rest of it. So I think I'm with you on trying to sort this stuff out, even though I have reservations about the online safety bill in actually, I think, potentially making the internet a less free place. But when it comes to children, right, that freedom has consequences. And I think we're seeing the consequences played out in real time.
Yeah, that's right. And I share concerns about free speech on the internet. Don't get me wrong, for adults, but I think it is a totally different ball game for children. And going back to the kind of point about influence, in schools we have some fairly strong laws about indoctrination, and you can't indoctrinate a child. You can't tell a child something that's political or unevidenced without sharing the opposing view. Now, I personally believe that law is being broken all over the country in our schools. But the fact is, when in our state schools, it's very clear that you can't indoctrinate a child, because we have an understanding in democratic countries about how important it is that you cannot push an ideology or a political viewpoint on children. Now, even if that was standing up perfectly in schools, which I don't think it is, we've now got this whole other area of influence on our children that is indoctrinating them, that isn't giving them a balanced point of view, that isn't giving them truth, that isn't allowing them to make kind of balanced decisions about this content. And that's the concern here. That's not free speech. I mean, what happened to Molly Russell is not free speech. And yet Instagram executives in the inquest defended the content from the point of view of freedom of expression. But that's ridiculous. I mean, take a step back from it. Telling a child that they should harm themselves or kill themselves is not free speech, it's abuse. And I think we've got to be very clear as adults that what we might be able to tolerate and understand and think critically about, children are not capable of doing that. And the best thing to do is not to allow them to have access to that material, just like you wouldn't allow a 3-year-old to cross the road on their own, because they're just not capable. And I think we just need to go back to an understanding of what parents are for, what children are capable of, and be much firmer as parents and adults about our role of protecting children.
Now, finally, Miriam, I want to ask you about the teachers being due to strike on 7 dates in February and March. Now, this comes quite soon, really, after the various lockdowns that took place. Now, we know that things like the development of kids has suffered as a consequence, that they're years behind in literacy and numeracy targets in certain cases, and some have been getting life-threatening infections like strep A, for example, due to not mixing with other children. Now, I wonder, where are you at on this, right? Where are you at on the National Education Union? Do you reckon that this union have actually got the best interests of kids in mind here?
Well, it doesn't seem like they do from their decision to strike, and it's deeply, deeply disappointing. As a parent, as a former teacher myself, I think teachers, yes, of course, they need to have a sensible attitude to their own interests, their own pay, their working conditions. Of course, that's perfectly legitimate. But ultimately, you become a teacher because you want to help the next generation to grow and achieve and to learn. And as you said, we've seen the most awful consequences for our children of lockdowns. Our children in the UK have missed more school than almost any other country, I think more than any other country apart from Italy, certainly in Europe, and missed almost half of their school days during some periods of the pandemic. And as you said, there have been all sorts of consequences, many of which we probably won't discover for many years, in terms of mental health, in terms of achievement, in terms of social development across all ages. And for those children to be facing again the prospect of schools being closed is just a tragedy. And of course I understand teachers, like so many people, are facing huge financial pressure because of inflation. Inflation is hitting us all. I understand that. But teachers are not... even the starting salary for a teacher is above the average wage. They get a significant pension contribution that most people in the private sector don't get. You cannot argue that teachers are objectively poorly paid and do get 13 weeks holiday a year. So I think it's hugely disappointing. And it was very telling that I think the NEU leader, Mary Boosted, opened her remarks with children only get one shot at school, and they do. And that's why this is so disappointing. And, I do hope they reconsider. But that's why I support the government's plans to introduce minimum service levels in these kind of situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, right, there is no generation more important than the next generation, right? The generation of children that'll come to one day be our leaders and all the rest of it. And my heart breaks for kids these days, right? You're either convinced that you're in the wrong body, you're exposed to highly sexual and explicit content in certain cases. If you're white, Miriam, you're told that you've got some form of white privilege or something like that. It just strikes me that being a child in this day and age is an absolute torment, essentially.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm normally a pretty optimistic person, but I do think our children, this generation is in a difficult position, and it is not just children; it's young adults as well. And that things like, for example, how difficult it is to get on the property ladder,
Yeah.
and how much tax they have to pay, how difficult it is to start a family. All these things are actually making this upcoming generation significantly worse off and with less hope, I think, than previous generations. And I personally want to see within the Conservative Party and within the country as a whole a move to rebalancing our policies and our agenda about raising up the next generation, about giving them the kind of hope and the chances in life. And the boomer generation that is now over 65, I mean, they've suffered in their own way. Of course they have. Every generation has its challenges, but they're also the wealthiest generation that's ever lived. They've got the vast majority of asset wealth in this country. And, for good reason, they are the biggest users of the NHS. But the result of that is that young people and children kind of making their way into adulthood are paying a lot of tax and not able to get on the property ladder because of this kind of strange difference between the generation. And we've got to find a way of addressing that because, as you say, the young people are the future.
Absolutely, Miriam. We'll leave it there, but thank you for ending it on that very optimistic note. And I'm sure the next generation of kids are delighted. But yes, Miriam Cates MP, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.